between. And that's okay. At least I know what I am. And that was helpful. I'm never going to know what it's like to be fully Canadian, to go play hockey, or to even want to be in the NHL. And I'm never going to know what it's like to go to cram school and get into Samsung. My experience, my story is something that maybe 95% of the world will never experience. Only people like you and me will. But at least I know now, and I'm happy with that.
It makes me wonder about, we have these ideas of what it means to be this culture or that culture. And you pinpointed, let's say hockey, very iconic for Canadians. Cram school Samsung, very iconic for Korea. And I'm also wondering, how accurate are these stereotypes that we project onto the culture at large? What about Canadians who are born in Canada who don't like hockey? What about Koreans who are artists and who also don't like cram school? It's this whole big complex question of, where do we see identity as being rooted? Is it in the things that we do, the things that we like, the kind of music and media that we enjoy and we can share together? Is it in language? Is it in food? Is it in a certain geography? And of course, the answer is like, it's this combination of all of that.
All of those things, yes.
Right. All of those things. And, and also like how we relate to those things, like all the different parts of ourselves that in the context of those complex environmental factors. As someone who has immigrated to Canada and has grown up in Canada, for me, you are a Canadian. You're Canadian the same way that I'm Canadian. But some people have this idea that, because I immigrated here, I will never be as fully Canadian as someone who was born here. For me, I have always considered the immigrant experience as the quintessential Canadian experience because of our history of being, comprised of immigrants.
Yeah, I don't know what it means to be Canadian. It's not something I think about now. I think the way that I think about it changes depending on the context. I think politically, we're all Canadian, period. If you have a Canadian passport, you're Canadian, period. That's the way that I see it. One way that another person told me is, look, we're all settlers. Doesn't matter what race you are. If you're not a native Canadian, that being like Aboriginal Canadians, we're all settlers. You might be a European settler, but you're a settler too, just a couple of generations removed. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The Canadian story is an immigration story.
Now, when you were in Korea, in the midst of dating all of these women who were lining up to be able to take you to McDonald's.
Yeah, I might have been exaggerating. It wasn't that bad. but it was the first time for me, so I felt like I was, wow,
How many women were you dating? Come on.
We won't go there. But I came back and I described what I was doing and what I did. And my aunt told me that I was playing in a field of flowers. They have an expression for it in Korean.
Playing in a field of flowers sounds so frolicky. It sounds so innocent, like there are all of these wonderful, shining, beautiful things around you, and you're just going through and visiting them as if you were a garden appreciator.
Yeah, that's what it felt like. I was like, oh my God, there are these pretty things that are looking at me.
But during that time, you met the woman who would eventually become your wife. Can you tell that story?
She sat next to me on the first day, and I remember thinking, oh my God, this is the woman that I think I would like to make my wife, which is really stupid, right?
You thought that? You really had that thought?
Yeah.
Wow.
Or maybe not that very moment, but in the weeks coming as I got to know her. We didn't date. We were just friends. We spent some time together. I held her in high regard and I liked her a lot. And after university, I decided, I'd like to go see what she's up to. So I got myself an English teaching job in Tokyo. And I went to see what she's up to. I didn't tell her, though. I didn't want it to be a burden. And I didn't know whether she was seeing anyone or married or what. I don't know if it's stupid or what. I don't know what I was thinking. Hanmin, that was so stupid.
Because she was your main motivation for going to Tokyo and getting a job there.
Yeah, that's how naive I was before. I think I watched too many movies back then. And I did, of course. And this is something I didn't really get to say earlier. But when I actually think back about my experience after moving to Canada, what I recall most is being home by myself and watching movies and television to learn about the culture and learn the language. I spent a lot of time by myself and solitary, and that was how I learned to navigate culture and society. And that had such an impact on me. And I wouldn't be doing what I am now if it weren't for that, because of the impact that images made and stereotypes, of course, because of the way that first Asians were invisible in any of the shows that I was watching. And if they were presented in such a way that made me ashamed of who I was. And I actually couldn't relate to those Asian characters' storylines because they weren't my story. And they weren't my friends' stories either. So I'm like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah, like what Asian is like this?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not to say they don't exist, but, you know, like the way that we spoke about it, the Asian narrative is diverse. It's not a monolith. The problem is that in the media, it's presented as a monolith, you know, the stereotypes, and that's what people know, and that's what people see. And that includes Asians as well, right? When Asians see other Asians on a dating app, they can't imagine the personality that might lie beyond it.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you say this, because up until the time that I started this podcast only a few months ago, I was not so interested in speaking to people of Asian descent because I thought I was the only one who was not a stereotype, or not the only one, but, you know, like one of the few people who was an unconventional Asian. You know, that I didn't resemble either the traditional Asians back in Asia, and I didn't resemble the people who fell nicely into the get married, get a house, get a car, get a kid narrative that a lot of my peers at that time fell into.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm this person who has lived in a whole bunch of different places. I speak 4 languages. I have had like 7 different careers, and I don't know what exactly will become of me, you know? But I realized that that view is also really inaccurate, and it comes from a lack of awareness of what other Asian narratives are. You know, like I was not able to see our own diversity. And now it's, let's fine tune the perceptions and let's ask questions and be curious and see all the little subtleties that people have, which make them all unconventional in some way.
Yeah, it's so wonderful that you're doing this. And even myself, before 8-9 months ago, when I came up with the idea for Alike, I wasn't aware of all these conversations happening within our community. I wasn't even aware this community existed. I wasn't aware of such terms as biculture or third culture. As I started working on it and connecting with people like you and others on Facebook, I was like, oh man, there's so many of us like this.
Yeah.
How could this not have been represented? It's incredible. How could we have so many stories?
Yeah.
How could it not have been shared?
Yeah. Yeah. It's mind-boggling. And I've been asking myself the same question, which is, with all the people out there who are living very similar experiences, how is it that I'm having such a hard time connecting with them? And of course, you know, now with the growing power of the internet and all these special interest Facebook groups and, you know, and Reddit subreddits and everything, it has become a lot easier. And I think right now there's something in the air, you know, as soon as I reach out to one person, I see that, you know, they're doing this and they're doing this and they're doing this. And it's beautiful. So it's a very exciting time for Asians globally. But I wanted to take this opportunity now because you mentioned, you know, the difference between biculturality, third culture, and this 1.5 generation. Can you talk about what the 1.5 generation is?
So 1.5 generation is somebody who immigrated into a Western country before or during their developmental years. So before the age of 12.
Yeah.
So someone like you who came when they were 6, or someone like myself who came when I was 8.
Right. And that is differentiated from first generation, where it's people who typically are adults already when they immigrate to the new country. And so they already have an established sense of identity from their country of origin, and they carry that within them even as they immigrate to this new country. So it's more of a question for them of how do we live, not necessarily who I am, because they know who they are, but it's more like how do we just make our lives in this new place. And second generation, they're born there, you know, that's all they know growing up. That would be like my sister, she was born in Canada, and there's not the same struggle of wondering like, where exactly do I fit in? But the 1.5 generation, we're the ones who remember the old country. we grew up, in the early years speaking the language of the old country, and now there's the new language, and now there's this fracturation of the identity within the self, and you have to like try to integrate it, or you have to try to choose sides at some point.
Right. Yeah. I think the second generations do experience that question of, oh, where do I fit in all this as well? Yeah. But it's different. Like
it's different. Yeah, certainly. And also, when we first got in touch, we were talking about what the difference is between biculturalism and being third culture. I had thought about this previously. I was like, what really is the difference? Because I grew up thinking that I was bicultural. So we immigrated to Calgary. I was Chinese Canadian. And I didn't know what the term third culture meant until quite recently. And so when I moved from Calgary to Montreal, moving into this different French-speaking European culture within the context of Canada, there was yet another cultural reference point to adapt to. And that's when I went from being bicultural to third culture, because the old culture where I came from in Alberta, being Chinese Canadian in Alberta, didn't hold any water in Montreal because they didn't know what it was like to grow up in Calgary. The people around me only knew what it was to be either Anglophone or Francophone. Well, not only, but, like generally. And so there was this whole like shift in perspective of like, well, I always presented myself as Chinese Canadian. But in this context of being in Quebec, that doesn't seem to be very important. They just care about which language I'm speaking. And so I'm an Anglophone.
Right.
And for the longest time, because I lived there for 12 years, I was like, okay, Anglophone, that's the main identity badge that I'm wearing. And the Chinese Canadian part just kind of fell into the background. And then when I moved back to China for a year to teach, all of a sudden that was very confronting, right? It was like, nobody really cares that if you're from Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary, you're just from Canada.
Canada, yeah.
And then there's that whole like readjusting again of how do I present myself to both my my international colleagues as well as to the local Chinese people who, they don't know the difference. And then moving to Germany, like another whole thing, right? Like they also don't really have an idea of what it means to be Chinese Canadian, the whole Anglophone, Francophone debate, the whole like, moving back to China. They're just like, well, you're from North America and now you're living in Europe. So that's the distinction that we're going to make.
You know what's really interesting about what you're saying? How much of our self-image is dependent on others' perception of us?
Yeah. Yes.
That intersectionality is so interesting to me.
Yeah. And it's like you only get a sense for what you are when you bump into something else.
Yeah, exactly.
And then like if you bump into something else in this context, you have a certain perception of where your edges are. And then you move the context and all of a sudden you walk in a different environment and where you're bumping is different. And so like you feel like the shape of yourself changes.
Yeah, we're almost like chameleons.
Yeah.
So then if we are, our color depends on what we bump into. Well, I guess that's our nature, right? That's the nature of chameleons. That's what defines them.
I wonder if chameleons are like, am I green?
Yeah, exactly.
Am I spotted? Am I striped? Or am I just a chameleon? Am I just myself?
Do they even think about it? I don't know.
We'll have to. Yeah. Next guest, chameleons. Special bonus episode. Yeah, but actually that's it brings another point to this, which is in the midst of constantly adapting yourself to a changing external context, what in ourselves remains constant? I believe that there is something that remains constant. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think it's going to be, I know a lot of people are going to say God. I'm not a religious person, so that hasn't been a constant for me. Religion and spirituality has always played an important role in my life. I actually consider myself religious in the sense that the whole universe is our God. It's one big organ, and we're just a small part of it. And maybe that's been my constant.
And what does that mean for you, to have yourself centered around that spirituality?
Yeah, we're all citizens of humankind. We're all just people at the end of the day. One of the conclusions that I came to at the end of that trip to Korea, at the end of the day, whether you're Canadian or not Canadian or Korean, or we're all just people at the end of the day, and we're all striving to be happy individuals. How you find that, I guess, is the question. And my question shifted from what am I to how do I find happiness?
If we just assume that the environment around us is always going to be changing in some way, how do we know who we are? You know, if one day I encounter someone on the street who looks at me like I'm an alien because I look different,